我们今天呢，一开始会一场这个专题演讲哦，主题是这个灾后复原的社会发展工作。But before that, before I introduce the moderator, let me just promote a book for you. 那在我们正式开始之前呢，有这个工商时间一下。And after 2014's conference, we have a book. This is the book. It's called Developmental Social Work, Theory and Practice. If you have known developmental social work, this is a very good reference for you. You can see developmental social work from different perspectives. But if you don't know developmental social work a lot, this is good too. This is very good for you to get to understand some basics of developmental social work. 那这本书呢，发展性社会工作理念与实务的激荡哦，是我们上一次的会议之后所集结论文所出版的一本书哦。And likewise, after this year's conference, we also have another book, Developmental Social Work. Advanced Policy and Practice. 那当然呢，我们今年的会议之后呢，也会出版另外一本书。Okay, so if you want this book, you can feel free to talk to our staff or go to Amazon, go to 博客来，线上也都找得到，或者是找我们的工作人员也都可以哦。那接下来我们介绍今天的这个专题演讲的主持人，我们非常荣幸的邀请到台大社工系的教授。冯燕教授 Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator for the keynote speech session, Professor Joyce Yan Feng from the Department of Social Work, National Taiwan University. 掌声欢迎。
好，谢谢。今天 Thank you to the MC, Dr. Leslie Cooper, our speaker. Dear friends from local and abroad, good morning. Hello. I'd like to express my respect for you today. The conference on developmental social work over the last 2 years, over the last 2 days, are organized by NTU and Eden Foundation. This marks a new milestone for developmental social work in Taiwan. Developmental social work is a very hot topic in the professional field and in the academia, and now officially it is going to it's going to spread its wings and show its real impact in Taiwan. We had a day off on October 31st. It was a national holiday, but right after the national holiday, we're glad to see so many of you join us on this very important issue for our society. I'd like to express my respect for you. As the MC mentioned, the speaker of this session is our very adorable honored guest from Wollongong University, Professor Leslie Cooper. Australia has a different school system from us. They are under the social work school, and they have various schools. However, the political system is very similar. They put health and social and welfare together in the political system. There is no such thing as social work faculty at Wollongong University yet, but they have a program for social work. So it's a different school system from Taiwan's. 2 days ago, our school had an excellent exchange with some of the faculties from their school, and we find a lot of commonalities. Just like in Taiwan, social work also developed from the social work faculty. At Wollongong University, it's even better. Social work is combined with health and sanitation, and now they are developing a specialization for social work. So because social work at their school is closely linked and interacting with health and other relevant fields. So I feel that they take on a much wider scope than our original school system. So I think there are a lot that we can take lessons from their school system. Professor Leslie Cooper specialization is very critical to most Asian countries because we all face natural disasters. We need to tackle the damage done to the land and property and our daily life. So disaster management is a topic we need to grapple with every day in our life and in our environment. Therefore, to have Dr. Leslie Cooper to share with us on this topic is a great opportunity. She's going to share with us some case studies of disasters in Australia. I hope today's lecture, together with further interaction with them in the future, will help us better face natural disasters. So we can tackle the challenges with courage and wisdom. So without further ado, please show your warm welcome to Dr. Leslie Cooper.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome and description of the social work program at the University of Wollongong. We are indeed looking forward to further exchanges with the National Taiwan University and indeed other countries in the Asia-Pacific area. As you know, we are Asia and New Zealand and Australia, we are part of the Pacific Rim and one of the areas where there are large and frequent disasters of many sorts. So thank you, Joyce. I've chosen to look at disaster recovery in 2 fires in South Australia. But before I talk about those particular case studies, I would like to acknowledge people in the room who come here from Taiwan and from other countries. It's so nice to be part of this gathering and to talk about social development. It takes me back to my many years as a practitioner doing community work. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank both National Taiwan University and Eden Social Welfare for this, for organising this event today, and for your care and hospitality for myself and from all my colleagues at the University of Wollongong, Lynn, Peter and Amy. A big thank you for the great effort that you've put into this conference. Yeah. I've been told to speak up. So the reason, why am I looking at natural disasters and fires in particular? There are 3 reasons. One is a very personal reason. The second reason is based on my practice experience. And the third is a result of academic experience. And you collect these experiences, which allows you to develop a piece of research that is personally relevant, but also relevant to the community. And I just want to share with you those experiences because they're all particularly relevant. So the first one relates to my being a mother. I come from South Australia, and South Australia is a very dry state which does have lots of bushfires. I lived in a bushfire designated zone, and my children both went to schools in bushfire designated areas. One of the things that they did and still do with children at schools is that they prepare them for bushfires, which I accepted as normal part of being diligent as a school. Recently, my daughter, who's now in her 30s, said to me, "I don't think you realise how traumatic preparing us for fires was. I had taken it in my stride as a parent, but never realised the impact of preparing children for disasters." So that has stayed with me, and I think what it reminds me of is the need to think about the psychosocial context and the emotional responses to disasters. So that was my most recent experience personally. The second experience was as a practitioner. For my sins, I was a community development worker, social planner, and also an individual worker, and I did that for 12 years before attending university. As a practitioner, I was working in Sydney at the time of Cyclone Tracy, and Cyclone Tracy was a huge cyclone that wiped out the city of Darwin. The Commonwealth Government sent planes, big, large jumbo jets, to Darwin and evacuated 30,000 people to Sydney. Working in Sydney, I was at the front line of receiving people who had nothing but the clothes they stood up in, no friends, no identity, no money, dislocated, unemployed, nowhere to go. So that was my first real experience. So how do we respond with the basic common human needs at the time of disasters? My next job was working in Cairns in North Queensland, again a cyclone-prone area. And here as a community worker, I worked with the State Emergency Services to start preparing the community in the event of a cyclone coming. So where would people go to? Where were the emergency centres? What did we need in those emergency centres? And then helping people to understand the dangers and the responses to them. The third experience I had was in Canada, where I was in a position of having to be responsible for the university's disaster management plan. And as part of that job, twice a year, we had simulation exercises around disasters. And most of those disasters were around active shooters. Because Canada and the US are closely aligned, one of the major concerns that Canadian universities had was active shooters coming on campus and killing students and staff and faculty. We managed those simulation exercises very, very well indeed. But one of the things that the university didn't do, it didn't think about what are the long-term psychosocial consequences of an active shooter being on campus, and then how as a university do we manage that process, because it is going to be a long-term process, not a short-term process. So that's my motivation. That was my motivation in doing this. What I wanted to do as an aim was to take the whole concept of social development community work and apply that to social recovery after 2 fires, and to assess whether these strategies are valuable in the long term as a way of improving both the response and the recovery to fires. I think it's really critical that we start looking at disasters in a research sense, because we need to start looking at communities in terms of what are their strengths, what are their vulnerabilities, and how might they cope in preventing and mitigation of disasters. I think we also need to share the knowledge that we have across the region so that we're better informed about approaches to the management and recovery of disasters. Australian government policy has 4 phases of disasters. It's very similar internationally in Western countries. There are 4 phases: prevention, preparation, response, and recovery. These are not sequential stages of the disaster. They go on at any one time simultaneously, and that's certainly one of the findings from the research, well, the study that I'm doing. So what my focus is on essentially recovery, but recovery starts just at the point that the disaster occurs. It doesn't wait for the response to finish. It's an ongoing process, and recovery takes from anywhere from 6 months to 10, 15 and 20 years before communities are fully recovered. I've chosen to use the social development model and approach, and I'm indebted to James Midgley for this, thank you. And I was saying to Jim on the way here in the bus, he's been, although I've just met him for the first time at this conference, he's been a presence in my life as a practitioner. I've carried your books with me as I've worked and travelled across Australia like a little Bible, and it's a comfort to go back and reread them and find that it's all very familiar and very, very helpful. So thank you, Jim. So the approach to social development, I mean, you know in the literature that it is more extensive than 3 lines on a PowerPoint slide, but for me social development is a planned social change process, and the aim is to improve the well-being of the population as a whole. And it's multifaceted. It's not just about community, it's transformative in its orientation, it's progressive, and it includes social impact, economic, political, cultural, environmental, etc. The overall goal, and that's the important thing, is social well-being. The Australian government has a huge amount of printed information about disasters. They don't call disasters disasters in Australia. They have chosen not to use that word. They use the word event. But I have chosen to use the word disasters because I think it's a common word. Event, people just look at you. So the government policy in Australia is that community recovery includes infrastructure and the built environment, and that has to be restored. So that's power, water, public health systems, etc., roads if necessary. It includes emotional and physical well-being, economic well-being, and lastly, the natural environment. That one is actually quite critical. So that's the model that I'm using for community recovery. In addition to that, there is an extensive amount of literature on community-led recovery. And as Peter Camilleri mentioned yesterday, some of the terms like community recovery and also the term resilience are very contested terms in the academic literature, and I share his concern with that term. So recovery is a social process. It's not something that can be done quickly. Recovery doesn't occur when the buildings are back in place and the power is back on. It takes months and weeks. Peter also mentioned yesterday that recovery doesn't mean returning to the old normal. The old normal may never be possible again. There may be only fragments of what life was like before. So it's a new situation. But as well as being a new situation, it's also an opportunity for creativity in working with community, in doing economic development, in doing cultural development, and taking that to next step forward. So the process in the literature for doing this is a coordinated approach and also an integrated approach. And by coordinated, I mean bringing together economic, social, environmental development and the built environment. So all of that is an essential part of the process. What I want to move now to is the structure for recovery in South Australia. So what we have, the central feature of community recovery is this local recovery committee. So it's a committee that comprises of a recovery centre or centres. It includes community organisations, agricultural groups or livestock groups, both of those are part of the process, town committees, so that could be from the local government, or it could be social services committees or informal groups. It involves the churches and service clubs. If I have one concern with this existing structure here, it is that I wonder how representative this community is when you take into account vulnerable populations, Indigenous people, or various groups that have settled in that community who need to have a voice at the table. The Local Recovery Committee is supported by the State Recovery Office. South Australia is slightly different to other states in Australia. In other states in Australia, local government supports recovery, but because South Australia is a small state, it's the state government that does it. The state government provides support, financial support to this committee through payment for recovery centres, for project office to manage it, for a community development officer, and for the local recovery coordinator. So it's a huge enterprise, this, to manage recovery in the local areas. Now to the two fires that are the basis of the case study. So the first one is the Samson Flat fire. I'm talking about two fires today. One is an actual bushfire, so this is trees and forest, and the other is more of a grass fire, and it's called a cropland wildfire. So this Samson Flat fire was burning on the outskirts of Adelaide, so it was considered, although not big in terms of size, was particularly dangerous because of the proximity to Adelaide. The forest that was burning was eucalyptus, and eucalyptus, when it burns at high temperatures, sends embers and branches up into the air, and these, with the wind, travel long distances, and ahead of the main front of the fire there are often spot fires, and it's these spot fires that cause a lot of damage in local communities. The fire was burning on a catastrophic fire day, which is a day when the temperatures are over 38 degrees or 40 degrees centigrade, and where there are northerly winds blowing. And these are days when it is absolutely difficult and challenging to control the fires. They start, they can't be stopped. So this fire started on the 2nd of January, and it was controlled on the 6th of January. The 9th of January. In terms of the damage, it wasn't significant in the scheme of things. 26 homes, 146 structures, 134 injuries, 5 businesses, but lots of livestock and fences. The area of Samson Flat is outer Adelaide, small settlements, retirement blocks, some commercial vineyards, and basically small subsistence farming because the land is not particularly good. And the challenge with the Samson Flat fire was access and communication. What you see there is an aerial or satellite photograph showing what you can see from the air. And Adelaide is all around this area here. as you will see on the next slide. So this is all the Adelaide metropolitan area, and there's the fire here and the wind coming from this direction, so coming from the north. And that's why the concern about this fire. Obviously pressed the wrong button somewhere. The next fire that I want to talk about is the Pinery fire, which, as I said, is a cropland wildfire. It started in November last year and was controlled on the 1st of December. It burnt out 82,000 hectares of prime agricultural land and some villages. The significant thing in terms of this is the number of personnel that were required to fight the fire. These personnel are generally CFS, Community Fire Services. They're volunteers, totally volunteers, and at times of fire, these volunteers come from interstate to assist in fighting fires in other states. So 311 Victorian volunteers came to assist in containing this fire. The fire started here as a little tiny grass fire, started going along this front, not a wide front. The wind changed direction and it became a huge, huge fire, burning all this farmland. Totally incompetent when it comes to this. In terms of the losses, there's a few things that are worth mentioning. Not many people died as a result of this. There were injuries and houses destroyed, but the three significant features are farm buildings that were destroyed. So these would be wheat silos and buildings that store fodder and hay, which is critical in terms of animal husbandry. The other is the number of vehicles destroyed. It looks as if it's cars there. In fact, it was very expensive agricultural machinery. So ploughs to plough up the soil, shredders, and various harvesters of, and these are upward of $300,000 and $400,000 Australian dollars to purchase. So that's a significant loss for farmers. In addition to that, the good thing was that wheat had been harvested, so there was no loss of grain, but there was a lot of loss of animals, mainly poultry and sheep, pigs and some cattle. Just if you want to know the economic loss of this, sheep at the moment on the South Australian stock market are $55 per head, and cattle are in the vicinity of $1,000 to $1,200 per head. That's just the loss of those animals. What you have in addition to that is if you need to rebuild your stock, you're having to buy stock at that price. So it's a significant investment that is required. I now want to move to look at the recovery process. So what I've done in this work is that I drew on source material from the State Recovery Office. And this source material were the regular bi-weekly, weekly, bi-weekly and monthly newsletters and various reports from the State Recovery Office. I haven't gone into these communities and talked to them about the recovery process. So it is simply based on information obtained from that documentation. So the analysis was based on what was presented in newsletters about various activities that were going on. I went through all of them and I classified them into two categories, community and also economic activities. I didn't look at prevention or mitigation, although I was aware in reading the newsletters that there was material on both of those. You can well imagine that there are limitations in this because it is based only on newsletters, so I'm not getting a full picture. It's not based on interviews, and it is also material which has been scrutinised carefully prior to publication so that it doesn't contain any damaging information to the community. So, and the results that I'm looking at include community and economic recovery. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to talk to you about pulling out the data from this information, starting with the economic or business activities after the Samson Flat fires. So in both the Samson Flat and also in the Pinery fires, there is a major problem that can be identified, and that is December, January and February are the time in Australia when people take their summer holidays. So schools are closed for most of this time. Government departments and civil servants take their holidays and are staffed often with only a skeleton staff. Universities close over this period and we take holidays too. So the amount of activity in the first stages of the disaster is somewhat limited. So in terms of what did I classify as information, not-for-profit, government assistance and education, just let me tell you what I included in that. So information was not just a phone number, but it was descriptive information about helping communities, about business activities. So that might be cash grants to support business from government, it might be about taxation, it might be about legal issues, particularly the building of fences or obtaining fire cards, and also about safety. So that was one particular issue. The second is the not-for-profit, and this was specific help provided to the community by not-for-profit. Help provided by the not-for-profit organisations specifically for business recovery, not for community recovery, but for business recovery. And there are a number of organisations that I'll talk about towards the end. Educational activities were those activities that were providing specific seminars that would help economic recovery, particularly targeted at farm communities, and government assistance was what the government invested, particularly from primary industries, financial support, or government grants. So that sort of very specific information. In terms of Samson Flat, as you can see, there was a lot of information provided at the outset. Education continued throughout the process, and there was government assistance and not-for-profit assistance. Towards the end, November and December, activities were winding down, and it was at this point in time that the Recovery Office, or the State Recovery Office, pulled their financial support for the recovery process. The Pinery fire, again, you can see December, January, the number of activities is limited. This Pinery fire, there were a lot more educational opportunities that existed. Information from government came much later in the process, and the recovery process in this is still ongoing. This fire started in November, December last year, so we only have data up until July and August this year. The complicating factor in the Pinery fires is that in September, this whole area was flooded. So not only did they have a fire last December, but they also had floods just in the last several weeks. There is a down time in May and June. The reason for the downtime in May and June is because that is harvesting time. So many of the community people were out sowing the seeds ready for harvesting in November and December. In terms of some of the commentary on economic activities, most of the activities were developed or directed towards economic well-being. Initially, there was more specific information from the government for Samson Flat rather than Pinery, and much of this was dealing with building asbestos, tree safety, phone and power supplies. Educational activities also played a key role in recovery from both fires. Now, let's turn to community activities. A very slow start in terms of community activities, but I should tell you how I classified community activities. One, education. Education activities were predominantly what I call psychoeducation. So these were activities which were targeted at individuals, not at communities, not at families, not at neighbourhoods. And it was an attempt to normalise the impact of the disaster. Not-for-profit didn't have a big presence, and I'll talk about that later, but what I included in that were things like Red Cross outreach, St Vincent de Paul tool libraries, etc. Events there were a huge number of events, and this is a feature of community activities in both fires. So as you can see, a lot of emphasis on events, a lack of presence of the not-for-profit sector and information provided by government in the community services sector. And we get a much more complicated picture here for the Pinery fires. And again, you can notice the dip in May, June in terms of the number of activities. So that's similar analysis of that. In terms of commentary of community activities, the number of community activities was smaller and events occurred later in Samson Flat than in the Pinery fires. One of the comments that came from the State Recovery Office was that the Samson Flat fires allowed the State Recovery Office to be much more assertive and effective in the Pinery fires because of their experience in Samson Flat. So what do we learn from all of this? So what I've picked out are a number of areas that I think are significant in terms of our learning. The first one is business support. The second is economic recovery, in particular the role played by the not-for-profit sector. And thirdly, in the economic recovery and its connection to environmental activities. In the community sector, it's worth noting, I want to note, the extent or lack thereof of government support to, especially in terms of provision of services to community, the role played by the not-for-profit in the community services sector, the importance and significance of health and social well-being, the role of education, especially community education, and lastly, events. I think these are the key learnings from that. In terms of business activity, you can see the strong involvement earlier in the structure of the Samson Flat fires in terms of the state's involvement in economic recovery. So business support was certainly provided by government and not-for-profit organisations. One of the significant organisations was a not-for-profit organisation called Rural Business Support, and it provided financial counselling and a lot of economic and financial services to communities. That could be around debt management or taxation, mediation, and also insurance. Insurance is a critical factor in the recovery from fires and any disasters. I've been doing some research in Christchurch, New Zealand. This is research which is focused on individual people, and it is now 5 to 6 years after the earthquake there, and still people have not had their insurance claims dealt with nor their homes addressed. So insurance is a critical factor in recovery, and people say we can't recover until these things are sorted. It's very destabilising. They're not living in their own homes, they're in make-do accommodation, their children are displaced and not connected. So the third one is general information from government. So government provided a lot of information. How do you deal with livestock? How do you manage waste? Because there's a lot of waste that comes from fires. The particular posts, which are copper, chrome and arsenic treated timber, they need to be disposed in a particular way. Fences and law around building fences and the negotiation around building fences and having it in the right place. And then a lot of assistance around hay and fodder. Governments also provided specific personnel, and these came from a number of government departments, not just one, DPI, the Environmental Protection Agency and Green SA. And one of the interesting features of business support is that the government in the Department of Primary Industry actually employs what I call, and this is an old-fashioned term, community agricultural extension workers. Their role is essentially community development. I have spoken to one of these workers who talked very passionately about farmers and farming, and the process that she adopted in terms of working with farmers to enable the farmer, the family and the farm to recover. So not-for-profit support was significant, and one of the significant organisations in this is an organisation called Blaze Aid. So Blaze Aid is made up of volunteers, and volunteers come from all over Australia to assist farmers in re-establishing their farm. And this includes clearing the land. It also includes rebuilding fences, getting fence posts, putting them up. And they do this as a collaborative effort, or they did, with the Toyota Four-Wheel Drive Club, who participated in that, and also Habitat for Humanity. So a significant contribution. They go in, they restore fences, and then they go out. Fences are important for farms because they need to keep their livestock contained. They don't want them in the fields where wheat is growing. They don't want your cows to be mixed up with the next door neighbour's cows. Livestock South Australia, which is a not-for-profit peak body, was very consistent in providing lots of individual advice and community support in terms of both educational activities and also seeds and fodder. There were various individuals in the community who assisted pro bono. In particular, there was a number of people who assisted in planning applications for new structures and new buildings and getting that through. And lastly, there were many educational activities from businesses for farms. Care for horses, large animals, soil erosion, soil sterilisation, use of herbicides, sheep care, and so the list goes on. And this was done on a very regular basis, and I think it's worth exploring further. The surprise for me, and it shouldn't have been a surprise, and that is the focus on environmental recovery. And this was a responsibility not only of government, but it was also the community, both urban community and also not-for-profit organisations, all contributing to trying to restore the environment, focus on the importance of biodiversity, because remember, after a fire, the soil is in fact sterilised. And so regeneration of the landscape and support for local fauna. So they were doing this on farms, they were doing it on watercourses, they were doing it around roads, they were doing it in the local towns. It was a community effort. Seedlings were provided, there were community engaged in trying to restore the community. There were numerous educational seminars on bushfire recovery and what that meant, how to restore the natural landscape, propagation, etc., and so on. And the government in all of this provided specific environmental assistance through their various agencies, and also provided seedlings from their various nurseries in South Australia. Community support. So the government supported the establishment of local recovery centres. These recovery centres I would perhaps best describe as an information and referral centre. They certainly didn't provide any counselling per se. The government support, I was really surprised in terms of our sector, the health and community services sector, was very, very limited indeed. In fact, in the Pinery fires, there were no health or welfare or services provided at all by the government. If you wanted services, you had to go into Adelaide. Not surprisingly, no one took up these offers. There was no coordinated or integrated care from government departments around health or mental health or children and other disadvantaged groups. It was totally absent, and that was very surprising. And no acknowledgement generally of specific assistance for any vulnerable groups. In fact, not even acknowledgement of vulnerable groups in communities. Yet we do know from previous research in South Australia that one of the groups who are most vulnerable are women and children, because what happens when there's a fire is the men go out to fight the fire and leave the women and children at home, and then they get in the way of the oncoming fire, which is devastating to local communities. Not-for-profit involvement was limited. Red Cross certainly had a presence in both communities, generally at the time of the disaster. They did provide support, psychological first aid, so that was very helpful. If other people wanted personal assistance, there were phone numbers provided. These phone numbers were generally national toll numbers. So if you wanted support, you rang up a national toll number. Some of those included Lifeline, Men's Line, Beyond Blue for depression. But often at the other end, there were volunteers who were providing support. So the community had access only to some very frontline services, psychological first aid, but you can only get that if you are registered. So this, as you can see, there is a lot of work that we need to do to ensure community recovery. Okay, community recovery, health and social well-being. In the literature on disasters, there is a lot written about the individual family consequences of disasters. But what we saw in this, there was little recognition, and it could be because of the nature of the communities, that they're rural communities, that they're independent and self-sufficient in many ways. But in the literature from the State Recovery Office, no recognition of complex psychosocial needs, or even things like triage. So how do people who are most in need and most distressed, how in fact do they get services? So that was absent. And even outside the area, there was little recognition of the need for stepped services. So psychological first aid is humanitarian and holding people's hands, giving sort of personal support, but it is not a specialist service. So that was absent. And no case management and no specialist assessment or interventions at all, which would be expected in a Western country. Interestingly, community education was very evident, and this was particularly psychoeducation. Psychoeducation was often written, printed information by the Australian Psychological Association. The focus was on the individual, and an attempt was made to normalise the responses to disasters. So in a sense, that information was very, very helpful. There were community workshops around education, but the focus again was first aid, psychological first aid and tips. And again, this was an individual focus. The social work profession in all of this was silent. There was nothing there about social work, about looking at micro, meso and macro levels. There was no educational material that linked to community support and the importance of social connectedness, in the importance of how you might work together with others in the community to facilitate recovery. And I don't know the extent to which the community development workers did any of this. My hunch is that it was minimal. Events. A feature of all these fires has been the number of events. So these included fundraising events, thank you events, generally to the fire services, coffee chats and mornings, movie day outs, men's events. There was quite a focus on men and their response to disasters, various workshops, even some writing and photography groups around disasters. The general impression in terms of reading the newsletters that these events were ad hoc, unplanned, unstructured, not inclusive of diverse groups and community members. And what was most disappointing, there was no evidence of links to community engagement and participation. I guess the question I have is, I think that events do play an important role in the social life of the community, but are we missing an opportunity with the arranging of these events to build more on community participation and advancement and future development? And I suspect there are opportunities at that level to do that. One of the activities that was people were involved in, and this was after the Samson Flat fire, and that is the community engaged around a particular activity which they called a mosaic couch. And when I saw this, I immediately, and aware of the importance of social enterprise, I thought here is an opportunity that a group might take forward and develop marketing and various strategies to promote this. And they may well have done. And now to the conclusions. So my conclusion is there was a greater focus on economic recovery than social well-being. Governments certainly assisted extensively with economic recovery, with many advisors and lots of support. And the advisors were providing a lot of information. I think they were providing a lot of emotional and psychological support to farmers to enable them to move on. So that part was very important. Environmental issues, I was, as I said, I was really surprised and very pleased, I have to say, that the government has taken landscape regeneration and support for local flora and fauna as part of the recovery process. Social and community wellbeing, I didn't think were being addressed in a coordinated way. There was no coordination from government, from the not-for-profit organisations, and nor from social work or indeed other professions. And psychosocial recovery from the fires really, and mental health as part of that, simply has not been addressed. So services are unplanned and people assume that communities will do this without any support. So in conclusion, the literature on social development is certainly helpful in analysing recovery, and further analysis of this can only strengthen progressive and transformative strategies to enhance social wellbeing of people and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. That's a very good report of those case analysis of daily framework analysis. I think it's a very good case report on those two fires, and I think I myself learned from this presentation a very good tool for us to use in the near future, and I hope not, knock on wood, for the future possible usage of analyzing the recovery of all the efforts put in. And we learned the Australian model of the collaboration or lack of collaboration from government and civil societies to do the recovery. But how about you? So we have 15 minutes left. So how about you? Do you have anything to share with us, or you have any question that will? Oh, 我的意思是说，那个现在。
What I mean is now is this Q&A section. Sorry. What I mean is that so I just share with you personally after this presentation, I learned a wonderful tool. That is, how should we view the recovery of after the disaster? She divided into two categories. One is economical recovery. The other one is community recovery. In Australian model, it looks like the government focus on the economical-oriented recovery. With regard to the community recovery, the coordination, integration is often been ignored, but the driving force is from government. So with that, we have more than 10 minutes left. I would like to invite the audience on the floor. Think about, are there any stories or issues you would like to ask Leslie, or when you heard her presentation, if you have any comment you would like to share with us. So the floor is yours. Don't hesitate, don't be shy. So who would like to be the first one? Okay. Professor Guo from Sichuan province. I came from Sichuan province. I'm from Chengdu Yidian. My name is Guo Hong. I would like to ask Professor Cooper that you mentioned the participation of NGO is not sufficient, but you only mentioned about the Red Cross. So my question is, out of those two fires, are there any other NGOs from other fields in Australia who participate in the recovery, and in what kind of field? I mean, on top of psychological intervention or appreciation, sharing informations, are there any other professional service out of those two cases? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I suspect that in both fires there was more extensive involvement of the not-for-profit sector, but that was not obvious in the newsletters. In terms of the newsletters, the fires were supported by Red Cross, global care, which St Vincent de Paul. St Vincent de Paul is a welfare organisation that provides food, it provides household goods and furniture, and it would have been involved in terms of housing people who had been displaced as a result of the fire. There were a number of service clubs who were involved, the Lions and Rotary as two examples. Habitat for Humanity was involved in building construction, so they were there as well. And the last group, I think, that was significant in the community, probably more in the economic recovery, and that was CWA, the Country Women of Australia. It's a very interesting organisation. It's comprises women from Australia who live in country areas. It's a long-established group, and it's established to women providing support for women. In recent years, it has changed its focus, and it's involving more people in towns, and it is actively fundraising post-disaster. So it was involved as well for providing financial support. There were extensive fundraising campaigns which were funded by the not-for-profit sector and then distributed by the State Recovery Office. So that's the type of support at the local level.
Thank you. 好，那谢谢大家都有听到翻译。好，那下一位。
Okay, looks like you have heard the translation, so we will go straight to the next question from James Migley.
I was fascinated to see you had one line at the bottom of one of the slides saying the social work profession was silent. We actually had similar fires in California just earlier this year, where widespread devastation of a rural community. I mean, there's thousands of people were homeless, and all the organizations that you talked about stepped up. And of course, social workers were involved because they're working for agencies, but the profession itself, which is based in the capital city, Sacramento, which was, an hour away from the fire, they issued no statements, they issued no, support or anything. It was just silent again. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, why the profession seems to be so reticent to come forward, or if it's something we could try and light some fires under them to get them more involved, because it's sort of embarrassing that, our profession doesn't, the medical profession would step up if there was a health epidemic. Anyway, sorry, I'm babbling.
Thank you. I agree, and I have to say I've been wondering just what I can do. I don't know that I want to start a revolution at this stage of my life, but what I thought I could do was set up a website and put information on that website that would be useful in terms of community recovery, and use that as a starting point. I think the other ways of doing it, this is a very slow process and it doesn't quite get to your question, but there are some government publications where we certainly could include information that would that are read widely. There are a couple of government departments that do contribute, and one is Centrelink. So this is the federal government department that used to be Social Security. They do pay for financial assistance and grants, but they are fly in and fly out. So, we know social work has a presence, but we seem to be sort of contained within our agency. We've lost the drive to be social change agents. which is, having grown up as fighting every cause there was, along with my colleagues sitting here in the front row, it is so strange not to have a body of students and people who are committed to that. I've searched at some of the social work websites, association websites. I know that the National Association of Social Workers in the US do have a website on disasters, but I have to say it is quite dated. The material is quite dated. It hasn't been updated. But this sort of stuff you've got to search to find. The Australian Psychological Society, what they have is that they have a group of social workers who are committed to working post-disasters. Admittedly, it's only in the area of counselling. As soon as there's a fire, they send one of their experts to communities to provide community advice. There is a lot of information on their website. They immediately circulate that to the local recovery centres. So the Psychological Society has got a good model to be adopted. I think there are opportunities in Australia and internationally. I mean, I think we shouldn't restrict this just to Australia. Part of the project that Amy and Lynn and I are involved in is trying to have conversations with colleagues in the Asia-Pacific area about some of these issues. What information can we share across national boundaries that would be very helpful and very useful to to help in this?
Thank you. 台大社工。
I will speak in Chinese. I would like to echo Professor James Midgley's comment. This is what I think. In Taiwan, the social work field is very active, but often we are wrapped inside an agency. So the agency service is seen, but the social work professionalism is not seen. Our profession is something very hard to team up with others, so it's hard to highlight our expertise in a team. Maybe that's one of the possible causes. So perhaps in the future we need to emphasize the expertise of social work and also ask for some credit, but would that be against our professional ethics? Or perhaps psychologically we can break through this kind of minor barrier. The next point is our disaster paradigm perhaps is still stuck on response mode. So we have not looped in prevention, preparation, and the recovery afterwards, especially recovery, the key issue that Leslie is talking about. I think a lot of the keyword comes into the recovery period, but as the data showed, maybe it was just 1 year and another fire, then the report is gone. So the data gathering is very short. And within the short term, it's harder to see intervention by social work. However, over the long term, for example, like the 1999 earthquake in Taiwan, we can see the social work expertise come into play much more clear over the 5-year or 10-year term, more clear than psychologists or government support, and going back to the community level. So if we look at the long-term recovery process, perhaps it's easier to see the presence of social work and less silent.
Thank you for that analysis. That was very good, and I certainly concur with a lot of the comments that you've made. Yes, in terms of this work that I've been doing, it is short-term. I believe that recovery takes a much longer time period than 12 months. That was the access to the data that I had. And Peter, yesterday, when he did his presentation, did his research over 3 or 4 years. after the actual event. In terms of will social workers have a much more active role 5 years after the event? I have to say in these two fires I would question whether they would be involved for that long. The services are simply not there. So I'm not certain of that. I think they should be there, but I think we need a process of demonstrating the importance of social workers. I think we do play a part in the response phase, but we also play a critical role in terms of the short and long-term recovery.
我们现在还有时间，最后一个问题。
We have time to entertain the last question. Professor Cooper, I'd like to ask you about the disaster response. You come up with a model at your school regarding campus shooting. Do you have different ways to tackle with it, or some features that you can share with us?
In Australia, we do not address campus shooting at all, to my knowledge. Australia has quite strict gun laws, so that they're restricted. Now, that doesn't mean to say that won't happen. I think the focus at a university, there's a lot the universities can learn from Canadian and American universities in terms of disaster management. That's my personal view. The focus or concern at the university I'm at is more on heavy rain and floods, and the extent to which those floods would devastate the campus. In terms of recovery from active shooters, I think there is a need to work actively with student associations, with health and counselling services, with international student organisations to work out what are the effective strategies in terms of support should these needs arise. It could also be local accommodation services. So there's a range of things that we could do which would be appropriate for social workers to do as part of their work.
Thank you to the participants for your questions. Leslie had the chance to share more of her thoughts with everyone. Thanks to them. It looks like time's up. I'm receiving lots of cues that it's time to wrap up. So if you have any more questions, please make good use of the break time and lunch time to discuss with Professor Cooper further. Thank you very much for your participation in this session. Professor Cooper shared her role as a mother, as a community social worker, 12 years of direct service, and her teaching, her research, and organizing official data to see what was done for recovery in Australia after fires. She provided us with tools and a methodology to review our own recovery work, whether it is economic or community recovery, and which areas we need to look at. I'd like also to add a few things. There was a question Professor Mickley asked social workers in Australia or himself in Sacramento, California. The role of social work was very silent. It was not seen. Professor Yang also responded with possible cause that perhaps social workers work within their agencies. I'd like to offer a reminder. In Taiwan, I beg to be different. As you remember, when the 9/21 earthquake happened, the most trustworthy party was not government fundraising parties. If you remember, it was Quanmeng, which is a united fundraising organization. It's all the social workers working together. 130 some national or local organizations and even new NPOs come up to work together. So the United Ways were to raise money. And then in 2009, after Typhoon Morakot, we had another mobilization of all the NPOs and the social workers. So those of you in the audience who are similar age like me have been involved in this. This is a great coming together by social workers and nonprofit organizations. And in 2008, Professor Kuo in the Sichuan earthquake also witnessed Taiwanese social workers responding to the needs of our friends in China. And together, we put together our experience in Taiwan and brought it to China in Sichuan. So a similar alliance came together in China. I think each country has seen its own development. In Taiwan, the social work field, whether there are officials or organizations, whenever there is a disaster, they are very willing to go through public formal and informal channels to work together. I think this is indeed very cherished experience. Perhaps in the future we can organize and compile the experience and share it with others. Shall we put our hands together again for Leslie Cooper? Thank you for sharing with us.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. 各位现场的贵宾，非常欢迎各位继续加入我们上午呢还有一个专题讨论的场次哦。And for the panel discussion, we are very happy to have our moderator, Professor Yunwen Gu, and also panel speakers from Taiwan, the U.S., South Africa, and also Australia. 我们有来自于这个台湾、美国、南非、澳洲的4位语坛人。那我们的主持人呢是这个国立台湾大学社工系的古允文教授。那我们接下来呢，时间就交给我们的主持人古允文教授。Ladies and gentlemen, now I'm going to give the time back to the moderator, Professor Yunwen Gu of Department of Social Work, National Taiwan University. 我们掌声有请我们的主持人。
谢谢司仪。
Thank you, the MC's opening. So second more important agenda this morning is the panel discussion. Since this is a panel discussion, let's just sit down and no need to stand up. This is rather a very important platform that we can exchange our experience in order to for the communication. We have simultaneous interpretations, so when we have open discussion, you can use your native tongue, English or Chinese, for whichever is most convenient for you to exchange our opinions and comments. So let's enjoy it. So this panel original arrangements was that we wish our government officers like Deputy Minister Li can join us because it is a very important concept and idea. But unfortunately, since October 1st, as you know, that the government's long-term care 2.0 goes live yesterday. So it is rather very busy and heavy loading for Minister and Ministry of Health and Welfare. So through the private sector's support, it is obligated to offer our comments and feedbacks. today we have invited a very important key person. That is Mrs. Chen Jieru. As you know, that everybody knows Chen Jieru here in Taiwan. In the past, I mean, now she is the chairperson of the Taiwan's Alliance for Social Welfare. Perhaps our international guest is not familiar with Ms. Chen Jieru, Ms. Chen. Allow me to take this opportunity to introduce Mrs. Chen to our friends. She used to be serve as a two-term legislator, but today she's not here as a legislator. But her contribution in social welfare for the past, so she started from the private sectors, and she has been played a very important role. She utilized all kinds of channels, the seminars, workshops, and so she's a very important vehicle to convey the concepts, ideas from the private sectors to the government and the public offices. So she has been effectively promote the welfare policies here in Taiwan. With that, she has a very good reputation in this field. So I always call her Sister Chen, and also to show my respect to her. So you can see by the way I address her as a Sister Chen means that she's a very important person in my mind. Okay, so we have learned a lot of new informations, new experience, and we always rely on her to convey it to the government. So today, I would like to invite our foreign guests to share their experience while they promote the development of social works. Each panelist will have between 10 to 15 minutes. So Sister Chen will be the last one. I'm going to ask her to share about the current status in Taiwan from the private sectors, and what's our expectation, and what kind of support we would like to see from the public sectors, and how we can collaborate between the government agencies and private sectors. So can I start from Jim, my right-hand side, and please take 10 to 15 minutes, and then I would comment on that. So can I invite Jim to...
Thank you, Ku. I'm happy to make a little start. We were discussing with Professor Ku what would be the best for us to talk about, and we thought the best would be to take some of the discussion that we had before. I don't actually need the earphones, sorry. To take some of the discussion we had yesterday and highlight a few aspects that we could bring to the forefront, and then in the discussion with the audience, with you, you may have some comments, suggestions, and thoughts to build on these topics. So we agreed, a very democratic group, that I would talk a little bit about some of the key principles in social development, social work, developmental social work, around the key principle of social investment and strengths and capabilities. Now, I showed that on the slides yesterday, but I didn't talk at much length about it, so I thought I can say a little bit more about that. Then Peter has agreed that he will talk about community participation. When we talked on the slides yesterday, we showed that social work in a developmental section, developmental sense is always focused on the community, right? It is the community approach. So Peter will talk about that and how we bring in the families, the community members who are our clients. And then Leila agreed she will talk about a very interesting point for us, which is implementation. You know, we are professors, we like to think about the theory, but how does it happen in the real world? How do you implement? What are the problems? And as somebody who has worked extensively in government, she knows a lot about implementation. So that is how we plan to do it. I hope it's okay. Okay, so let me begin and talk a little bit about strengths, capabilities, and social investment. Somebody asked when I went to the session yesterday afternoon, explain what is the difference between conventional social work and developmental social work. That was very well answered by the colleague who was on the stage. But I thought, let's think about that again. And let's think about that in terms of the history of social work. Where does social work come from? Well, I'm sure you all know about the history of social work, especially how social work developed, first of all, in England, in the charity organization Society that focused on individual families. And they were the people who trained the first caseworker, the first social workers who went to help these families. And I'm sure you heard about the settlement houses. Again, the first settlement house was established in London. I think it was 1874, if I remember correctly. And then very quickly came to the United States, came to European countries, and came to countries in Asia as well. The idea that you have a community center. Well, there has always been a struggle in this profession of social work. What is it that we do? What is our identity? What is our purpose? What is our mission? And the struggle has been a lot between the social workers who say we are engaged in direct practice with needy people who are our clients. We individualize our treatment for them. And the others who said, no, our work must be based in the community. And it is community practice, community development that we should do. Well, that is a very long history of struggle and competition about these two approaches. Now, it is very clear that the struggle has been won by the people who believe that social work should be individualized, treatment model, caseworker working with a client. And in fact, if we look at the history when the social work profession in the United States around the time of the First World War began to organize, when the leaders said, we want to be a profession, that Mary Richmond, anybody heard of Mary Richmond? Okay, very famous woman. She is actually our grandmother of all of us. And she wrote in 1918 a very important book called Social Diagnosis. Now, this book was really the first book in social work. And she said the social caseworker is like a family doctor. This she calls social physician, is treating the problems of these families. And this helped solidify the idea that social work is a clinical profession, individualized profession working with individual clients. Mary Jarrett, who wrote after the First World War, very influenced by Professor Sigmund Freud's ideas, she was even stronger. Social work is not really a physician, a medical. Social work is a psychiatrist, because she wrote very strongly that all social problems have a psychiatric origin. She wrote a very famous paper called The Psychiatric Thread in All Social Casework. Now, it doesn't mean that community practice, the heritage of the settlements, was extinguished, but it has been pushed to the side by the mainstream clinical approach in social work. At Berkeley, 80% of our students want to be direct practitioners. In the United States today, the statistics by National Association of Social Workers, 80% of social workers are working in settings where they are doing problem solving with families. Now, the problem solving approach, I'm not going to argue we don't need to solve problems to help people. But in the 1970s, a professor at Berkeley who actually was a PhD graduate at Berkeley, his name was Dennis Salibi. He said, you know, we're always looking for the problem. When we go to the client, we say, let's find the problem. we never think maybe the client also has strength. The client that we are working with in the family, and he is a clinical social worker, and he wrote some really important books that made a lot of us think, wait, why are we always trying to find the problem? Why are we always trying to find what is wrong, the negative? Let's look at the positive, because everybody who has a problem also has a strength. And in the area of community development, in the early 1990s, two professors, they're not social workers, but they were a lot of experience in community social development and social practice, called Kretzmann and McKnight, came up with the asset approach. And it's the same as strengths approach. When you go to a very poor community, what do you see? Broken window, many poor people, a lot of gangs, a lot of negative things. And Kretzmann and McKnight said, wait, just change your mind and look again. And what do you see now? Oh, I see the churches. I see small business. I see people organizing. So look at the positive, look at the strength. Don't always look for the problem. And I think these two lessons, two approaches give a strong lesson for us in social development. Because social development and developmental social work is based on a strengths approach, okay? Doesn't mean we don't deal with problems. We have to help those who have a need and who need to be, even some people who have mental illness, but as I explained in the slides, we have to think about a different way of dealing with it. So a strengths-based approach gives us an opportunity in developmental social work to use the idea of social investment. Now, I think the social investment idea builds on the strengths model. You know, if a client comes to you for help, you can't say to the client, oh, but think about your strengths and go and be strong. No, the client needs some help. And the community, we can't go to the community and say, oh, don't worry, you got strengths, good luck. We have to utilize resources to build on the strengths. So, as I explained, and because of the time limitation yesterday, I didn't really develop this very much, but the idea of social investment, which I showed on the slides, and this is important for our field to be able to be talking in a way that the economists can understand and appreciate. It is important in our field that the political leaders, the legislatures, the government people can understand what we are doing and appreciate it. We go to the government and we say, oh, we have many poor people, give us money to help the poor people. Okay, maybe the government will do that. What about if we say, we want some money for investing in poor people, and we are going to pay back the money and more? Very strange idea, right? But it is the basis of economic theory in social investment. So if you go to the bank and you have, I don't know how much, 10,000 Taiwanese dollar is not enough, huh? 50,000. Yeah. Okay, you want to open an account, okay? And the bank says, sure, we'll put it at the bank. And you say, how much is the interest? How much will I get back? More than I put in. If the bank said, no, you don't get anything more, you'll go to another bank to find the bank that gives you a good rate of return, right? You will get interest. Now, in the United States and Europe at the moment, there's very, very low interest. But still, you are getting in more out than you put in over time. And that is the theory of a very, very simple idea, right? That if you allocate resources over time, if these resources work in a positive way, in an investment way, they generate more resources. So the four investments that I talked about yesterday were human capital investment, social capital investment, investment in livelihoods through jobs and self-employment, micro-enterprises, and lastly, investment in assets, the things that people have, wealth that people have. The human capital idea came in the 1950s, and I explained to you that Professor Schultz at the University of Chicago was really one of the first. Actually, Chicago had a whole lot of professors who were doing research on social, they didn't call social investment, they called human capital. So Professor Schultz and Professor Becker, who was also very famous, both received Nobel Prize, argued that when the government spend money on education, primary school, universities, if it's done properly, you get back more money than you spend. Actually, Berkeley, we know from studies, makes $10 billion every year for the people of California. Unfortunately, the politicians don't seem to understand that if they put more money in, they get more money. And Schultz and Becker demonstrated that if you have education, there is a rate of return, interest, comes back to the individual, right? So the money that is spent on education will benefit you. We call that private rate of return. But also it will benefit the whole community. That's called social rate of return. So the $10 billion that Berkeley generates is the social rate of return, which goes to the community. If you think about Silicon Valley, all the internet developments, our university together with Stanford, huge investment that became hugely productive. Well, Professor Schultz was doing research in India, and he studied the attempt by Indian government to control mosquitoes because of malaria. And over a period of 5 years, they found that as the mosquito malaria went down, what happened with the agriculture? More wheat was produced. More crops were produced. So everybody was very surprised because everybody thinks controlling malaria is important because we don't want people to die from bad diseases. But nobody thought, actually, this is a good economic investment. And now from that original research, we have very sophisticated mathematical econometric models developed by many economists. In certain areas, higher education, my old friend from London School of Economics, George Sakharopoulos, has done amazing research quantifying the rate of return, he calls, to different types of educational investment. And Amy talked, and she'll probably talk today about Professor Heckman's work and his equations on how early childhood investments have payback, generate returns over the long run. So human capital started us thinking about investments. The other types of investments, very, very quickly, social capital, if you're familiar with the writing of Professor Coleman, also at Chicago, and Professor Putnam at Harvard. Coleman was watching this research on human capital, and he said, it's not enough just the education. You look at the community in which the education takes place. Look at the role of the teacher association, the family support. And he said there is a capital in the community linkages, in the networks, that also produces human capital and therefore generates the rate of return. So Putnam's research, the first research he did in Italy in 1973 with 2 Italian professors, they studied the areas of Italy that had high economic growth, areas with low economic growth. Areas with high economic growth, they had strong networks, community associations, many activities. Other areas, quite low social engagement, civic engagement, he called it. So here again, when we build community networks and we are doing community practice, community development, it's not only intrinsically good, but it also has an economic spin-off. Of course, employment and self-employment, we heard yesterday about micro-enterprises and many of these projects, the Streetwalker project with coffee for the homeless people. All of these are investments, right? Our colleague who spoke about how he raised with crowdfunding the money to get the coffee going, that is an investment, but it generates a return, right? They got more out than they put in. So this is a very clearly defined area where, again, when we contribute to employment generation, self-employment generation, we are using the investment model. And the last is the asset development model. Now, Professor Michael Sheridan, a very good friend of ours, and I know he has been here at NTU many times and has worked with Professor Lee Chen, and we heard about the savings account. If you can get people to have assets, that has a future payback. Same in the community. If the community develops commonly held assets, schools, community center, clinic, that belongs to the community, these are investments that generate returns. So just think a little bit about strengths, think about investments, and how important these are in differentiating the developmental social work from what can be called the conventional social work. Okay, thank you. Did I go over a lot?
好，谢谢 Jim 为我们所做的再次的。
Thank you, James, for your clarification. Very detailed sharing of his thoughts. And today, when we look at a lot of community, it's not just about the perspective. We need to identify strengths in getting away from poverty. Every time James starts, I hesitate to interrupt him because he references so many different places, and I learn so much from him. So I'm glad that that in addition to his simple lecture, he also added some food for thought for me. Perhaps we need to look at welfare in a more positive way to change it into an idea of social investment, and also look at the positive side. The second person sharing with is from Australia. Peter Camilleri, and Peter is going to share with us his work in community participation in Australia.
Thank you. And following really Jim's comment around Putnam, which is really an important writer in the area of community participation, for most of social workers, we really actually don't work with the whole community. We actually work with those who are excluded on the whole from community participation. We really are working with those who are the poor, who are vulnerable, who are disadvantaged, and we're working with them on the whole for a collective outcome, not an individualistic outcome. And I think that's an important aspect of why we're interested in community building is not working with those communities who are able to participate and have the resources to participate. It's those who've been structurally excluded. And that's becoming more an issue in Western countries with issues about migration, with issues about refugees and coming into countries where they're often seen as non-citizens and have little or no access to resources. How are they able to participate in a meaningful way in the society? So the important part of the core principles we have about community development is about including and engaging the other, those who are seen as different and strange and who are not included in the general community. And how do we make the services that really look at the desires of people and how they want to live their lives, the way they wanted to build their own communities? Also, when the resources are provided by governments, who uses them, who manages, who directs these resources, who has control over those resources? Most of the time, it's downward pressure, down, rather than upward determination of use of resources. I think Jim mentioned yesterday in his speech around how the disability sector has been one of the most important changes for how we've conceptualised service delivery. Where there's been a huge shift, and an example that's occurring in Australia at the present time is that there's a huge shift of funding of disability services from funding to agencies to funding of individuals. So the individual disabled person will have access to resources that they determine with others around what sort of services they want, how they want to live their lives, and what things they think they need to live it more effectively. And there's been quite a as we know, with disability sector, there's been quite a major shift in the narrative of exclusion to inclusion, a shift to where disabled people see that they need to participate in the general community, to be able to determine their housing, moving from residential services to housing that is the same as everyone else, but with accesses to make it effective for them to live in those communities. We've also seen it with work and business about one of the shifts that are occurring is making sure that disabled people are able to work effectively in businesses, and that you have to support people in business enterprise. We've also seen it in terms of education, ensuring that people who have a disability have the same access to education, both at school level but also at higher education level to education. And of course, some of us perhaps have witnessed the Olympic Games and the Special Olympics, the Disabled Olympics, how in some ways we're seeing a shift in the way in which there's a perception around athletes who have a disability and how they're perceived by the community, and have been received much more positively than in the past. There is for a lot of the developed countries, there is a tension between the rhetoric around having social enterprise, social investment, but also having an increasing paternalism. One of the developments that are occurring in Australia is the what's called a welfare card trial. So rather than providing cash to people through their bank accounts, they're going to be given a card that will determine 80% of how they can spend their social assistance. So there'll be no discretion. That will have to be spent on food and other particular predetermined goods and services, and with only 20% of discretionary funding. Which is really in conflict with giving people choices about how they're going to make decisions about what's best for themselves and their family, and what that means in a community sense. The issue around justice reinvestment also has that too. There's a lot of research that we know that if you can prevent people going into jail or keep them out of jail, then the cost to the community, both in terms of actual financial costs but also community costs, is restricted dramatically. We also, I think Jim outlined that the historic tension in social work between community development, community work, and the individual, and how they're often seen as disparate ways in conceptualising how we work with people. But there's also been a tension for the last 100 years about those who are deserving and non-deserving. And I think we're starting to see, particularly in Australia, but I presume in the US similar, that there is a increasing rhetoric about who are deserving of services and who are not deserving. And those are the usual suspects. That those are people who have drug and alcohol issues, those who with mental health problems, those who are seen as new migrants, are often seen as those who are non-deserving of services. So at a community level, how do we engage and build upon and work with them? So we need a new narrative that shifts from that dichotomy of deserving, undeserving, and we've been trying to do that for 100 years, but hopefully with concepts around social reinvestment, social investment, that we can actually start seeing that you can actually build stronger communities. And I think that's probably a nice spot to stop, because Leela is going to talk more about how do we actually implement these ways of doing it. So I think at this time I'll turn over to her.
Thank you, Peter. 好，谢谢 Peter 给我们做了一些。
Thank you, Peter. Going from Australia's experience to talk about social assistance and community building. Of course, in addition to bottom up, we also need to think about how to implement these things. Yesterday, we saw a lot of participants ask Leila about how to apply these in social work, and also questions about how the government can apply developmental social work ideas. Please share your thoughts with us, Leila.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I wanted to perhaps go back to the title of the session was about social policy and institutional arrangements. And I wanted to build on what Jimmy said, James, and also Peter. So the challenge is, how do we devise and implement social development policies that are developmental? Now, this is a huge task, because if you are developing social policies from a treatment approach, then it's pretty contained somewhat. But how do we now integrate this complex set of principles, social investment, assets, capabilities, strengths, participation, and communities? But then, in addition, social development also takes the view that governments play a leading role in social development, but that they do so in collaboration with individuals, families, communities, NGOs, civil society organizations, and also corporate social responsibility programs, for example. So that does make social development policy making quite complicated, as well as its practice. And I think that is why so many people say to us, how do you implement this? So I wanted to just share with you a few thoughts, and we can certainly, in our conversation, we can pick up on this a little later on, is about social development policies. And so I do so also using my hat as a South African and my experience in policy making and in policy development in South Africa, because we adopted a developmental social welfare policy. So not many countries have that. But having done that, the question then is, does this work in practice? And what are some of the problems with implementation? So let me start off to say that I still think that social development policies are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about change in people's lives. I think that it allows us to make large system changes. So what are those barriers or systems that prevent people from achieving human well-being? And yesterday I sat in Sadia Hussein's session, and it reminded me it resonated with what we do in South Africa, and I'm sure in many countries. So she spoke about the problem of the barriers that girls face in obtaining an education. And she spoke also about one of the key barriers being problems in the education system, but also that there are policies and marriage laws that say the marriage age is actually 16 in some provinces and 18 in others. But there isn't a national age in their country, as I understood her to be saying. So if you've got policies like that, how do you make it happen and implement it so that it makes a difference in the lives of girls? And if you do that, then I think systemically we would be breaking that cycle of intergenerational poverty of young girls who lack education in their country, and early marriage, which basically passes the young girl on to a a male in another family, and then the family, her own family, feels that they do not have to care for her. So other ways of achieving large system changes is through recognizing people with disabilities, discrimination, promoting gender equality, promoting employment. Now, there are old policies such as minimum wages, for example, would be a macro policy that would make a big system change, for example. Looking at employment policies currently and the growth paths of countries economically, and how does that impact on people? What are the social costs of those large system changes that occur, and who bears those costs? Are the families and the communities. So I wanted to just remind ourselves about social development policies going from your micro to your meso level, and then macro and wider policies. So just very quickly, I've got 5 more minutes, I think. So why do these policies with the best intentions, as in the case in South Africa, why do they fail? And we often don't ask ourselves that question. So I wanted to maybe just raise a few points that we could pick up later. I think that the design of these policies, if they are not integrated policies that take all those complex interconnections into account and the effects of those policies on people's lives, then I think that there are often serious design flaws. So how do you have cash transfers that achieve developmental outcomes? So they do, and it makes a huge difference. But cash by itself might not be enough. What else do people need to complement cash, such as services, health services, education services? If infrastructure is not there, if there isn't transport, all of those related supporting services, I think together will make a huge impact. Then I think it's also related to evidence-based policy making, that often it's a good idea. And we learn about good ideas in conferences. But are these ideas tested? Do they have the effects that we think they will have? If they had it in the US, do they have it in Taiwan? Does it happen in China or in Hong Kong? Can we assume that the conditions are so similar in these countries that we will have the same outcomes? So I think a lot of research is also needed to design policies that will work. A third thing I think that is important in policy making is funding. So we have lots of great ideas, but we have unfunded mandates. So you have a policy that says we're going to do this, but the money doesn't follow the policy. Then it doesn't get implemented. Often policies are not costed. So yesterday at the function, I asked the the social worker who's working on long-term care, to say, well, has this policy been costed? What will it cost Taiwan if you implemented it? So those are important things to bear in mind. Since many people advocate using NGOs, working with NGOs and government to work together, we find that government underfunds NGOs to deliver the services. Yet they expect them to deliver the service at a cheaper than government, and we see in South Africa that they deliver it at a cheaper rate, because if government delivers it, it's often a lot more expensive, because the salaries for social workers in the government are higher than it is for social workers in the NGOs. So government is passing on its responsibility and stepping away from taking the responsibility for services by getting NGOs to step in. And that would not lead to just and fair and equitable policies, outcomes. The fourth issue is about human resources. That is, do we have the people to do the work? So often we go with a professional model. Social workers want to be professionals, even if we are developmental social workers. And we feel that we want the recognition and status for our profession. So we keep out paraprofessionals. But if we're wanting to make a maximum impact and a difference, how do we work with professionals, paraprofessionals, different service providers, care workers, many different people who play their part in reaching a higher impact? The other point I think that is critical in implementation is about coordination. We know that government and large systems and bureaucracies work in silos. So health services are delivered on their own. Social work services are delivered in another little box. Housing is in another box, and so on. How do we engage with all of these different parties who are and stakeholders or disciplines or sectors to work together? And it's very difficult because there's also power between the different bureaucracies. And so I think that that is a huge challenge because social development is working across sectors. And if we can't do that effectively, we actually can't deliver. So that remains a big challenge. Then I think monitoring of our deliverables. Often our policies are not clearly formulated, so the aims are not clear, what the outcomes are to be. And we monitor it throughout this process. So, and that then doesn't allow us to find out what is happening, unintended consequences. How do we address that? Or we wanted to achieve certain milestones and we didn't achieve it. So how about hearing from the people themselves, the beneficiaries, the participants, as Peter says, what they think, how they're interpreting and experiencing the service. They have a lot of knowledge to tell us about how it's working or not working. So I think that feedback loop is very important if developmental policies are to succeed. But another problem is compliance. If we have policies and we don't have an inspection or a follow-up or a service to a check where the minimum wages are being implemented, well, it's a nice policy to have on our books. But if people continue to exploit others, then that makes it even more difficult. And in closing, I think I would like to mention just the question of politics. I think that politics is a dirty word for many people, but political will and support and commitment and winning the support of different interest groups to make policies happen firstly, pass them, but also to implement them is crucial, and maybe we can pick up on that later. Thank you.
好，谢谢莱拉。在南非的。
Thank you, Laila, from South Africa's experience, told us that it is very important to play a role from the government sector when we want to promote the social works. So we need to coordinate and work, create some synergy. So the policies are very critical. And she also mentioned that it may sound ugly when we talk about politics, but it is inevitable, and with that it comes to Sister Chen. For years she spent many hours in the legislative yuan, and then to promote respective policies. So she also encountered a lot of frustrations and challenges. So we are very honored to have Sister Chen here with us to share her experience. Yes. Thank you, Professor Gu. My dear friends from social works field, good morning. Today, actually, I'm on behalf of Li Zhensi, Professor Li Baojing, who's supposed to introduce the long-term care here in Taiwan regarding version 2.0 long-term care. But there are many changes. Changes happen every minute. So, and also they have a meeting in the legislative yuan. So the chief executive officer asked me to come here on behalf of them to present, for the past 20 years with regard to the trend of social works developments. Of course, I'm going to share with you some of the policies I engage in the legislative yuan. For the past 20 years, the social works have some progress significantly from national budgets allocation. Now it is still already surpassed education and national defense. So it becomes so-called the number one in social welfare. Social in the year 2011, we have established so-called social security system and set up new milestones. With regard to the social security, it is a major milestones to provide pensions to those who don't have a job, especially for housewives. Or with that, we can say that it is 100% covered for the national insurance systems. We also have, in 2006, we have established so-called the Legal Support Foundation, so that the government have allocated about 1 billion NT dollars for those legal aids. So that's the role of the foundation is to make an assessment of the judges, although they are volunteer to fight for those underprivileged person. They also have make a report about inappropriate judges. So we also have established a system to review the quality of those judges. So although there are not many, but most of the judges, they work very hard. But perhaps because of the time constraint, they lost their opportunity for appealing, and some of the recipients, they have complained, they are not very satisfied. 2007, here in Taiwan, we have a very major issues that is about the credit card debts for the consumers. So those person has to be filed bankrupt. Or it happened in Japan. I mean, in 2002 until 2006, we amended the constitution. So we have, the no responsibility or after liquidations. So there are more than 50% of the person are free of those burdens. In 1995, we have passed the national health insurance law. So we have moved health insurance to top in the world. So after us, during the 8 years tenure in legislative yuan, we have amended constitution all the times because the world is changing. There are many emerging cases. So with regard to the children, the juniors, and the women's and the disabled person, with regard to their human rights and anti-discrimination, gender equality, etc., are all passed in legislative yuan to be in line with the international trends. So most importantly, now we have health insurance, we have the other insurance. So we need to fight for the right for the residencies. For example, the government is supposed to increase the subsidy on the rents, and the ruling government is trying to offer 200,000 the project housing in 4 years. So while that budget is ongoing, so at the moment I'm the chairperson of the Taiwan Alliance for Social Workers or Social Welfare. So from our alliance, we want to suggest the government to set up a certain percentage of the budget to the needed person, and so what kind of support the government should provide, etc. So the proposal for those social welfares are often proposed by the amateur person without comprehensive planning. So, for example, the household subsidy, we have set up a reference like 85% or 15% of rental discount from the average. So, however, many young people still cannot afford it. So, especially for a lot of disabled person who are also low-income groups, they got a chance to receive the subsidy, but they still cannot afford that kind of rental cost. So they, in the end, they have to give up that kind of services. So I know here in Taipei City, we have quite a few the project housings. I have some correspondence with the Taipei City Mayor Ke Wen-je. I told him that we should set up, say, like 60% discount or 55% of average rental fees. For example, it is the household whose the family household income is like less than the average income for a certain level. So we should have the additional subsidy by the government. So otherwise they still cannot afford it. So what I propose is that we should have set different levels. Now the 30% discount is not classified. So we should have a different rental system for people with different incomes. So that's something I'm trying to propose to Taipei City Mayor Ke Wen-je. But they need to propose a budget. If they don't propose a budget, then they don't have money to spend next year. So the government provides the land, so the construction cost will be much lower. So with the national property, we use the national property to build the housings. Then the central government allocate some subsidy, then we can build a public housing. So now we are trying to amend the government's regulations or certain acts. So now we are trying to adjust the standard. Otherwise, it won't be the allocation won't be appropriate. So now we have proposed long-term care version 2.0. The project lasts about 10 years. Unfortunately, Deputy Minister Lee is not here. But if you have elder senior citizens and where you have migrant workers to serve as domestic helper, so as a whole, if you say they represent the majority of the disabled person. The disabled service is even worse, but the management or the regulations are more generous or more reasonable. So there are no ceiling for the support to senior citizens. So however, for the acute and severe seniors, there's no subsidy for those kind of substitute service. Which cannot convince the general public. So I wish our new long-term care 2.0 can adjust or change those areas. The other one is in the future, we want the agency who should take care or carry over the long-term care 2.0 are NGOs. So now with that, when we look at the Procurement Act, we need to evaluate whether the current Procurement Act really fit that future practice. So is it a partnership between the government and the private sectors? So with regard to the overall statutes, we need to talk to the Department of Social Welfare to see if there's a need to propose a new program or like outsourcing or contract the private sectors. So now we are under study to see if the Procurement Act can exclude the prior requirement for the public construction projects. I think that will be a major change for Taiwan. I think we are a partner for the government. So for the social welfare sector should work together to fight for this right. However, we cannot just do it just with one shot. We need to train our talents. We need to accumulate the experiences. This is the challenge to people in Taiwan. The most difficult problem or challenge is the human resources. Now we are talking about the government's the working hours requirement, like the 2 days leave per week. We need to take care about the financial issues, subsidy issues, and reimbursement issues, as well as human resource issues, before we can propose a comprehensive social work system. Thank you very much.
Thank you for clarifying a lot of the efforts made by the government over the last few years. But as Sister Chen said, with the long-term care 2.0 and as well as social housing, sometimes we've been looking at it more from the government's perspective, less from people's needs. So her organization has dedicated itself to pass voices from the public to the government. Now we have these social housing projects. Can people afford to live in? That's the key to filling these up rather than leaving them disused. So you need to step away from the government's point of view and think about the public voice. You build a lot of projects, but the vulnerable cannot afford to live in. And that becomes a gap. Sister Chen said, echoing Laila's comments, the government and the private sector are partners rather than a boss. The government is not our boss. It should work as our partner. They should not boss us around on what to do. Instead, we should work together on what's best for Taiwan's people. So that echoes what Laila says about coordinating and collaborating. Looks like we have 15 minutes left. I've been given an extra 5 minutes. I will open up the floor now. Feel free to use either Chinese or English. Please briefly introduce your name and organization. We have 4 panelists up here, so feel free to address your question or comment to anyone or all of them. The floor is open now, and you can also hand in your question sheet.
I have a question to
Professor Micheli. You talked about the investment on the developmental social work. And as a social worker, I totally agree with you that the more investment on the developmental social work, the more return we can get. But as you know, the government has their own portfolio. They have to invest their budget to different aspects of our society. For example, the businessman want the tax reliefs. They told the government that, you know, if you give me tax reliefs, I will give you back more, maybe more than, you know, the returns of your investment on the social work. So how can we persuade the government that the investment on the development of social work is better than the investment on other aspects of the society? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Very good question, and very big question. Actually, I will give some thoughts on that, and I ask Leila also to say something because she has been in government and the other side, where she has to try to allocate resources. I think the first thing is it's not simple. It's a struggle. It's a huge struggle. You know, when I went to, and I think people of my generation will remember, for some reason there was always money. When we, and with Peter and I were talking about it, we went to university, we were so heavily subsidized. You know, we paid tiny fees, and that was almost all over the world. Governments seemed to step up, and the problem was not the lack of money, the problem was the way the policies were implemented and designed. Then there came a huge change. And exactly as you are talking, if we think that in Britain, the top tax rate was somewhere like 80%, and when Mrs. Thatcher won the election in 1979, reduced to 36%. When President George Bush won the election in the United States in the year 2000, he came to office, 2001, he reduced the top rate of tax, and a huge give back to the business community and to wealthy people. Even I benefited. I'm not super rich, but even my wife and I benefited from that, and we didn't need to have that tax back. That tax didn't make us work harder or feel that we have more incentives. So we face today, compared to the times before, a deep, deep struggle, ideological struggle, over shared responsibility. Mr. Trump has been saying in the election campaign that he's going to take care of everybody. He's going to take care of the steel workers who lost their jobs. He's going to give money for children and childcare. But he's also going to cut the taxes, the biggest tax cut in the history of the world, he said. So we are in a very strange situation of dealing with these things, where governments are now promising to do all sorts of things, but then cutting the resource base. We have just one more little problem that, you know, where I live in the Bay Area of California, we have a number of companies, Apple, Google, Facebook. Guess what? They don't pay tax. I pay tax, right? I pay tax on my property, I pay tax on my income. They shift their profits to overseas low tax places, and they pay taxes on that, and they hardly pay any tax in the United States. And I'm very angry about that because they are my neighbor. They use the roads that I pay for. Their children go to the schools that we pay for, and they don't pay tax. I mean, or they pay very, very little tax. So just saying that as a background, and also to share my frustration, and I know what you're saying too, how can we get government to step up? Well, I think one of the key things, and there are several things, it is the ideology of government. You know, government is, who is campaigning to control the power of the state? The state is incredibly powerful. The state is the only institution that can use the force of coercion to make you and me do what the state wants us to do. So how do we get control of the state in a way that makes sure that the state acts in the interests of social development and the well-being, the welfare of the people? Clearly, this situation in the United States and now in Britain, Mrs. Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, has announced that she's going to reintroduce government-supported private education, and so education inequalities in children will increase. So how can we have good politicians who will take the state in the right direction? And that is a struggle. And these elections that we have now are so, so important. Unfortunately, our young people at Berkeley are not so interested in the election. You know, the young people say, well, we don't like Hillary very much, and we don't like Mr. Trump, so we're not going to care about that. And I say to them, you are giving the power of the state to the wrong people by not voting and participating. So ideology, who is the leadership, and participation. The role of activism, this is not my field. I'm from the policy kind of government top-down. Amy has done very interesting work on advocacy organizations. Who advocates? And we were talking last night that I didn't know the power of advocacy organizations in the 1930s of the time of the New Deal, when President Roosevelt introduced so many important social programs. I thought it was a very kind president. Yes, he was a very kind president, but he also had political pressure from the trade union and from different organizations and women organizations. So I think that is the next thing that we should look at, is the role of activism. And finally, there is the international dimension. You know, when the president of an African country goes to an international conference to check on the progress of the Millennium Development Goals, or now the Sustainable Development Goals. 1995, in the conference in Copenhagen, all the world's governments many powerful government leaders were there at that conference in Copenhagen, the Social Development Conference. And they agree we set targets. We're going to reduce the poverty. We're going to reduce infant mortality. We're going to reduce child mortality, maternal mortality, sorry. We're going to improve. So all the targets were developed. And in 2000, in New York, in United Nations, they all agreed Millennium Development Goals. 5 years later, they all came back. And they put up there, which country did what? Oh, the president says, my country, we are now number 145. And the neighboring country is 112. And I'm going to speak to finance minister. I'm going to speak to... So actually that had quite a big effect on increasing government budgets for social programs in many parts of the world. So I think all of these are things that we can think about in terms of getting government to, yes, we need roads, of course we need roads, we need good airports, we need trade, but government must have the right priority in terms of making sure that the basic human needs, the social development needs of the people are met. Because again, coming back to investment, that will produce a return for government. Anyway, sorry, too long.
好，谢谢 Jim。好，那我手中有一个问题，不过我刚刚看到是陆教授的举手。
I have a question in my hand, and I also see Professor Lu raise his hand. He's a guest from far away, so let us give him the privilege of asking the question.
James, Peter, and also Lila. I think it is a overlapping of these issues. So social investment, community participation, and also policy. And so I just wonder whether there's an affinity of certain types of social investment. For example, in community-based business, community-based social enterprise, or social and solidarity economy. Is that a special brand of these social investments that what is your opinion about that? And the second is for Lila is about the scaling up of these kinds of efforts. Is it in South Africa there's certain kind of social programs or policy that has certain inclination or skill towards supporting these kind of community-based enterprise or cooperatives or community and solidarity economy? So that's my question.
Well, I'll just make a very brief comment. I think we have in the academic world and in the policy world, the practice world, a lot of fluidity, and terms are used in a very interchangeable way. Now, you know, the social economy school kind of came out of the non-profit school or the voluntary sector school with more of an emphasis on the kind of activities, social enterprises, and so on. And social enterprise itself is now emerging as kind of a new field. Social development has been since the 1950s. The language slightly different, but my opinion, the message is the same. I think what is happening in the non-profit world, the voluntary sector world, is much more emphasis on investment and returns than before. You know, before there was sort of charity model. We have to give to the poor, government give us, we give it to the needy people. There is much more of a discourse of investment and return. And I think also that leads, and you get that in social economy literature as well. But I think that leads me just to repeat something that perhaps I should have made a little bit clearer. I think that discourse of social investment has tremendous political potential in the hands of advocacy organizations and political organizations. If you are a minister and you have a very strong opposition, or you are in the leading of the opposition, actually the Labour Party did this in England, but they overdid it. They kept on talking about to the Conservative government, allocate money because you will get a return, right? You will get a return. And the Conservative government replied, you just want to spend money, and so you're pretending there's an investment. But the main thing is that I think, again, in these areas where we have such a fluid group of many different people, the narrative, the discourse of social investment has potential political power if it's used effectively.
I think what you are asking about is there a package of social investment policies that are social and economic that work together? Is that right? Now that's a hard question to answer, because we know broadly from historical investments which ones have worked and which ones haven't. So that would be my starting point. So we go to look at the developed countries. What are the packages of social investments that they've made? It's always been education, basic health care and primary health care, you know, social housing, public assistance and cash transfers, and so on. But the whole economic development package of what goes into that is not clear. So, and that is not, we have never had a say as social workers in those policies. But I think what social development or this approach allows us to do, based on our own experience, because we work with people, is to also contribute to that conversation. So there are different ways. We've heard about social enterprises and micro enterprises, and it's how can local governments or local authorities, for example, support people who are already pursuing livelihood strategies. As I said yesterday, of grant beneficiaries who get a child support grant, 25% of them run some kind of livelihoods activity. Now, that's my next piece of research, is to find out what is it that they actually do, how successful is it, why do they do it, what does it benefit, does it bring to them, what are their barriers, what would make a difference. And based on that information, we would be able to say to the City of Johannesburg, where we're going to do this work, is that your policies to support informal sector workers, for example, and largely women in the informal economy, is outdated. It needs to be adjusted. Here are some ideas for changing it. So I don't have a recipe really to follow. I think that you're doing such wonderful work in China, that you've told us about, and your colleague has also mentioned, Rong has mentioned, how she's taking that knowledge from the communities where you're working to the provincial and state level, and higher up in China. So I think that that is for me, a very workable way of taking forward these ideas.
OK， 好，那因为刚刚有一位
All right, because there's one social workers from Taipei City government sent a text message to me. So now I'm going to raise this question. He talked about when we enter a poor community, we encounter cross-cultural, ethnic issues, how to deal with that kind of cross or barriers. So he didn't mention who he would like to have answer. So can I just ask Peter?
I'll be very brief. Time, so we probably all need to head off. Cross-cultural practice in social work is a challenge for all of us. It's a particular challenge in Australia. I think for the profession of social work, it's been very much a challenge in that most of the social workers have come from the same cultural group, the main cultural group, and it's how we encourage others from different cultural and ethnic groups to become social workers, and what barriers we often put in place in higher education institutions. So I think that's one of the important things about how do we have more diversity of cultures within the profession itself. I think in the US, there's a lot more writings on multicultural social work and how to work effectively with different cultural groups. In Australia, it's something that we have to confront, and it's a challenge for social work and human service agencies in Australia because of the multiplicity of different cultural groups with different languages and different expectations. And the hardest thing, I think, for the practice of social work is that we still very much have an individualistic focus, where for many of the new ethnic groups that arrive in those have a much more collective view of family and community, and the challenge that makes for social work. Thank you.
Okay, I checked with Laila. She said Peter already covered most of it. So because of time constraint, she has no further comment. Now it's 12:20. I think you are all hungry. So I'm going to raise last question. Do you have the question? If you don't ask, you cannot enjoy your lunch. No? Okay. Then thank you very much for your participation. Let's complete this section.